Welcome to Life Stories. In today's episode, we dive into a tale of betrayal, deceit, and ultimately, justice. When one man tried to manipulate his own family for money, he never expected the truth to come crashing down. What started as a simple family gathering quickly turned into a moment of reckoning. Secrets were exposed, relationships were tested, and the true cost of lies was revealed. Stay tuned as we unfold this incredible story of standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. I had always tried to keep a low profile at family gatherings. With our history, it was often easier to stay in the background, keep my distance, and avoid the constant drama that seemed to follow my relatives wherever they went. This time, however, the family reunion at Emma's house was different. I had a gut feeling that something was going to happen, I just didn't know what. You see, growing up in a family like mine wasn't easy. There was always a sense of tension in the air, like an unresolved chord that never quite found its harmony. We had our moments of love and connection, but they were fleeting and often overshadowed by money issues, grudges, and unresolved conflicts that seemed to stretch back generations. I had spent most of my adult life distancing myself from it all. I loved my family, of course, that was never in question, but after so many years of witnessing the same patterns, I found solace in my own success and independence. I worked hard to build a life for myself, one that didn't rely on anyone else's support, and for that, I was proud. But then there was Tom. He was the black sheep, the one who always seemed to be looking for a quick way to get ahead without ever putting in the necessary work. I don't know if it was because he genuinely believed he was unlucky, or if he simply didn't know any other way to live, but every time he came around, there was always some new scheme he was pitching, some business idea that would make him rich or some wild investment that was just on the verge of taking off. The truth, though, was that none of it ever panned out. He never kept a job for long, always had an excuse for why things didn't work out, and consistently borrowed money from family with the promise that he'd pay it back. Which, of course, never happened. I had long stopped being part of his dramas. I was doing well for myself, and that was all I needed. But in Tom's eyes, my success was never just mine. No, according to him, it was something that I owed to the family, to the sacrifices that had been made on my behalf. That's why, when I walked into Emma's house that afternoon, I had no idea that Tom had decided to turn a simple family reunion into a stage for his grievances. At first, everything was calm. People were talking, laughing, catching up. My cousins, the ones I genuinely liked, and I had small talk over the buffet spread. Emma's house, while not enormous, was welcoming, filled with the laughter and chatter of people who were meant to be family. I had come, as usual, partly out of obligation and partly because I didn't want to stir up trouble by not showing up. But as the afternoon wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. Something in the air was about to change. Then it happened. Tom stood up. The entire room seemed to pause as he cleared his throat dramatically, stepping into the center of the room with the kind of expression that could only mean one thing. He was about to make a scene. The smug look on his face said it all. I could feel my stomach tighten, and I instinctively took a sip from my drink, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom started, his voice lingering in the air like he was preparing to give a performance. "I just want to take a moment to talk about something very important. Something that affects not just me, but all of us." The room quieted as his voice rose. I could see the faces of my relatives, the ones who had been around long enough to know Tom's ways, grow tense. They were preparing for the worst. But I wasn't prepared for just how far Tom would go this time. "Family," he continued, "is about supporting each other. It's about being there in times of need. And yet some people here," he paused, his eyes darting directly at me, "seem to have forgotten that." A hush fell over the room. I could already feel the shift in energy. I leaned back slightly, waiting for him to continue, already tired of whatever nonsense he was about to spew. And then came the accusation. "You see, my dear nephew," he said, his hand sweeping in my direction, "has done very well for himself. Big house, fancy car, vacations, living the high life, and that's great. Really it is. But what about the people who helped you get there? What about the family that supported you? That raised you? That made sacrifices so you could have the opportunities you did? He went on, playing up the victim card. His voice full of theatrical sadness. I've hit some hard times, he said, shaking his head in mock sorrow. All I've asked for is a little help. A little bit of generosity from someone who has more than enough. But instead I get ignored. Left to struggle while my own blood lives in luxury. A murmur began to spread through the room. Some people, who I could tell had been conditioned to feel guilty, glanced at me. Others, perhaps knowing better, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could see my mom, sitting across the room, already rubbing her temples. She knew exactly where this was going. She knew Tom too well. But he wasn't done yet. His voice rose, gaining strength. But that's not how family should be. Is it? Family helps each other. Family doesn't turn their back when someone is drowning. And then, there it was, the moment of his dramatic accusation. So I ask you all, is it fair that my own nephew refuses to help me, while he sits on a fortune? All eyes were now on me. Tom stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for the room to react. He probably expected people to turn on me, to pressure me, maybe guilt-trip me into handing over cash. But the room fell silent. Not a single word. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of the situation build before I stood up slowly. I wasn't angry. Not at all. In fact, if I'm honest, I was a bit amused. Because what Tom didn't know was that I had come prepared. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. That's really interesting, Tom, I said, my voice calm but firm. Because if I owe you so much, then maybe you can explain this. I unfolded the paper and held it up for everyone to see. Tom's face turned white the moment he saw it. It was a legal document, a loan agreement, signed by him, outlining the terms of a loan I had given him 5 years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. This wasn't just any loan. This was the moment when everything Tom had tried to say about me started to unravel. The room fell into an eerie silence as I held up the loan agreement. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on me, the tension rising with each passing second. Tom's face was a mixture of shock and panic, his pale complexion telling me everything I needed to know. He knew exactly what I was holding up. It was the one thing he'd never expected me to reveal. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. It was almost like he couldn't comprehend the situation he was in. The smugness that had once defined his every movement was now completely gone, replaced by something that resembled fear. I wasn't about to give him the chance to recover. 5 years ago, I continued, my voice steady and clear. When you were in desperate need of money, your words, not mine, I lent you a generous sum. But I wasn't foolish. I had you sign a contract. I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the expressions on the faces of my relatives as they started to realize what was happening. A simple agreement stating that you'd pay me back within 2 years. I could feel the weight of the room shift. People were starting to whisper, exchanging glances. My mother, sitting across the room, let out a long, frustrated sigh. She wasn't surprised. Not at all. She had been watching Tom's antics for years. But this was the first time I had ever publicly brought them to light. Tom was sweating now. His hands were trembling as he wiped them on his pants, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He opened his mouth again, as if trying to find a way out of the mess he had created. But no words came. I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. You never paid me back, I said, taking a step closer to him. The contract still held high for all to see. Not a single cent. His face contorted with confusion. And then, predictably, he tried to deflect. I was going to pay you back, he stammered. It's just, things have been tough. You know, I had a few setbacks. I raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. You've had 5 years, Tom, I said, my voice growing sharper. 5 years to pay me back. And yet, here you are, standing in front of everyone, trying to guilt-trip me into giving you more money. I let the words hang in the air, letting the weight of them sink into the room. The family members who had once given Tom the benefit of the doubt were now looking at him with expressions of disbelief and disgust. The game was up. He couldn't play the victim any longer. And then, just as I thought I had him cornered, Tom snapped. "Don't act so high and mighty," he suddenly shouted, his voice shaking with anger. His face turned red, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're better than us just because you have money? You think you did everything on your own?" The room went silent once again, the air thick with tension. Tom was shaking now, his voice cracking as he continued. "Who do you think raised you? Who fed you when you were a kid? Who made sacrifices so you could go to school? You owe us. You owe this family." I stood there, staring at him, my jaw tightening. I knew exactly what he was trying to do: rewrite history. Make it seem like my success wasn't mine alone. He wanted to make it feel as though I owed everything I had to him. To the family, like my hard work and sacrifices didn't matter. He wanted to twist the narrative and make it about him. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite the frustration bubbling up inside me. Then, slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. "Okay, Tom," I said, keeping my voice steady, though the sarcasm in my tone was evident. "Since we're talking about the past, let's talk about the real sacrifices made." I unfolded the second document, my gaze fixed firmly on him. "Do you remember this, Mom?" I asked, turning to her. She squinted at the paper and then let out a bitter chuckle. "Oh, I definitely remember that," she said, her voice tinged with both sadness and anger. I turned back to Tom. "This," I said, holding up the second document, "is proof that when I was 18, I had to get a job on top of my studies because our dear Uncle Tom drained my mother's savings account." The gasps in the room were immediate. People turned to Tom, their eyes wide in shock and disbelief. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. I wasn't finished yet. $155. "Tom," I said, my voice now ice cold. "Gone just like that." Tom opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. "Did you ever pay it back?" "No, not a single cent." The room was in chaos now. People were murmuring, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some of my aunts looked at Tom like he was something disgusting, their faces twisted in disgust. My mother's expression was one of quiet, resigned anger. She had lived through it all. But seeing it laid bare for everyone else to understand, it was something else entirely. "You want to talk about sacrifices, Tom?" I said, taking a step closer. "What about Mom having to skip doctor's appointments because she couldn't afford them? What about me, begging for extra shifts at a gas station so we could have electricity?" I paused for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle. "What about all those times you promised you'd pay it back, and then just disappeared?" Tom's face was crimson now, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth were gritting. He was starting to realize that he was losing control, that the family was no longer on his side. But before he could even try to twist the story again, I delivered the final blow. "And let's not forget the best part," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "After everything, after all the lies and the money you stole, you had the audacity to show up at my graduation and ask for more." Another round of gasps echoed through the room. Tom's mouth hung open in disbelief. His eyes darted around, realizing that no one was going to defend him. His usual tricks weren't working anymore. He was trapped. The tension in the room was unbearable. Tom, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation, took a step back. His fists were clenched at his sides, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He was cornered, and he knew it. There was no more room for his usual manipulation or excuses. The truth was out. He had bled this family dry. And now everyone could see him for what he truly was: a liar, a manipulator, and a thief. For a moment, I thought he might finally accept defeat. I expected him to slink away, maybe apologize, or at the very least, try to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left. But instead, something far worse happened. Tom, in his desperation, lunged at me. He moved like a wild animal, his face twisted in rage. I barely had time to react before he was right in front of me. his finger pointing accusatorily. For a split second, I thought he might actually hit me, a thought that, strangely enough, didn't scare me, but rather filled me with a sense of disbelief. How could he do this? In front of our family? How far would he go to avoid taking responsibility? Before I could even raise a hand in self-defense, my cousin Mark, who was built like a linebacker, sprang into action. He grabbed Tom mid-lunge and slammed him back onto the couch with a force that made the entire room jump. The chaos that erupted in the room was instantaneous. My aunt screamed in shock, while Uncle George shot up, ready to intervene. The air was thick with anger and confusion. "Get off me, you piece of..." Tom's words were lost in the frenzy as Mark, using his sheer strength, shoved Tom back down onto the couch, effectively restraining him. "Enough," Mark barked, his voice firm. "You don't get to pull this crap anymore." As I stood there, still in shock at what had just unfolded, I could feel the collective weight of my family's eyes on me. My heart raced in my chest. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that the family was finally, unequivocally, standing together against Tom. No longer were we divided or uncertain. Tom had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I looked across the room at my mother, who had risen to her feet, her expression a mix of disbelief and fierce anger. She stormed over to Tom, who was still thrashing on the couch, trying to free himself from Mark's grip. "Are you out of your damn mind?" she snapped, her voice sharp with fury. "You're going to attack your own nephew because he wouldn't bail you out? After everything you've done?" Tom's face turned even redder. But he didn't respond. He was breathing heavily, realizing that the family he thought he could manipulate was no longer on his side. The realization was palpable, and it hung in the air like a heavy fog. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse for Tom, something happened that changed everything. In the back of the room, Aunt Patricia, who had been quietly observing the chaos, stood up. She had always been the quieter one, the one who preferred to stay out of the drama. But today, her anger was too much to contain. "I've had enough of this," she said, her voice shaking with both anger and hurt. The room fell silent as everyone turned toward her. I wasn't going to say anything. But since Tom wants to talk about who owes who, let's talk about the money he stole from me. Tom's eyes widened as he turned to face her. "Pat, what the hell are you talking about?" he sputtered, clearly caught off guard. Patricia's hands shook as she pointed directly at Tom. "You took my husband's life insurance money." "Tom," she exclaimed, her voice cracking, "you told me you had a great investment opportunity. One that would double the money. And I trusted you. I gave you $330 that was meant for my kids. And you lost it all. You stole it from me." The room froze. For a brief moment, I thought I was dreaming. How could Tom have done this? How could he have betrayed his own sister, his own family, in such a devastating way? My mind raced as I processed the enormity of what Aunt Patricia had just revealed. Tom's face turned ashen, his eyes darting around the room, clearly searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The truth was out now, and nothing could stop it. "I didn't lose it. It just didn't work out," Tom muttered, his voice shaky. But Patricia wasn't having it. "Shut up," she yelled, her voice cracking with emotion. "You told me you'd pay it back in a year. It's been 10 years. Tom, where's my money?" Her words hit like a sledgehammer. Tom didn't even try to argue anymore. He knew he was cornered. He was exposed. I stepped forward, shaking my head in disbelief. First my mom's savings, then my money, and now Patricia's life insurance payout. I said, my voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "How many more people here did you scam, Tom?" A heavy silence followed, and then, as if on cue, another voice spoke up. It was my cousin Robert. "I let him borrow $5 last year," Robert muttered, his face hard. "He said he just needed a little to get back on his feet. Never saw a dime back." More voices began to rise as other family members spoke up. Each one had their own story, their own tale of being swindled, lied to, and manipulated by Tom. It became clear to me, in that moment, that Tom hadn't just been borrowing money from us. He had been draining the life out of our family for years. The final realization hit me. This wasn't just about a few loans or borrowed cash. Tom was drowning, and the only way he knew how to survive was to find another person to squeeze dry. His victim this time was me. But now, it was clear, he was done. As Tom stood there, defeated and broken, his usual bravado completely gone, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. For years, I had been carrying the weight of his lies, his manipulation, and his constant demands. Today, it was over. The family had united against him, and he was no longer the center of our lives. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it now. After a few moments of silence, Tom turned and bolted out the door. The room was still, with everyone just staring after him. His departure felt like the final nail in the coffin. He had thought he could run away from his problems. But now, the family was no longer the source of his support. It was the source of his downfall. The following weeks were filled with action. We didn't just sit back and let it end there. Each of us took legal steps to reclaim what was ours. Patricia filed her fraud case. I filed my lawsuit for the loan he never repaid. One by one, the family members who had been wronged stepped forward. And we watched as Tom was finally held accountable for his actions. His reputation, what little was left of it, crumbled as the truth spread across social media. The lies he had woven for years unraveled quickly. In the end, he lost everything: his home, his business, and his freedom. No one trusted him anymore. As for me, I moved on with my life. Still successful, still thriving, but now, free from the toxic presence he had been in my life for far too long. So, remember this lesson. You can run from the truth for a while, but it always catches up with you. And sometimes, the best revenge is living well, free from the weight of betrayal. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories.